What happens when your worst night becomes the beginning of your greatest love story? Tonight, we're diving into a heartwarming BL romance that proves sometimes getting stranded on a dark highway is exactly where fate needs you to be. This isn't just another gay love story. It's about finding your home in the most unexpected person. Get ready for a cowboy romance that will leave you believing in destiny. Picture this: Ethan Miller, a 28-year-old marketing executive from Denver, driving home from the worst business meeting of his career. It's past midnight on a lonely stretch of Colorado highway, rain pelting his windshield like bullets. He's already replaying every moment where his presentation went wrong when, bang, his front tire explodes. And just like that, his terrible day becomes something else entirely. The sound was like a gunshot in the storm-heavy silence, followed immediately by the sickening thud-thud-thud of rubber shredding against asphalt. Ethan's BMW lurched violently to the right, and for a terrifying moment he fought the steering wheel as the car tried to careen off the rain-slicked highway into the darkness beyond. His heart hammered against his ribs as he managed to wrestle the vehicle to the shoulder, gravel crunching under the remaining good tires. The engine shuddered to a stop. In the sudden quiet, broken only by the relentless drumming of rain on metal, Ethan sat frozen, white-knuckling the wheel. His breath came in short, sharp bursts, fogging the windows. The leather seat beneath him was damp with sweat despite the cool night air seeping through the vents. Every muscle in his body felt coiled tight, as if he'd just narrowly avoided stepping off a cliff. Jesus Christ, he thought, finally loosening his death grip on the steering wheel. His hands were shaking, actually shaking, and he stared at them with a mixture of disbelief and disgust. When had he become this person? This jumpy, anxious mess who couldn't even handle a blown tire without having what felt suspiciously like a panic attack. 6 hours ago, he'd walked into the gleaming conference room at Meridian Industries with his laptop, his perfectly rehearsed pitch, and enough confidence to move mountains. He was going to land the biggest client of his career, the presentation that would finally prove to his father and himself that leaving the family construction business for marketing hadn't been a mistake, that his degree from UC Boulder meant something, that he was more than just another pretty boy in an expensive suit playing at being important. The meeting had started well enough. Handshakes all around, coffee served in those ridiculously small cups that cost more than most people's lunches. Ethan had smiled, made small talk about the weather and the Broncos' chances this season, all while his laptop synced with the conference room's display system. Everything was going according to plan, until it wasn't. The slides had frozen on the third screen, right in the middle of his demographics breakdown, the one with all the carefully crafted charts and graphs that had taken him 3 weeks to perfect. He'd clicked the remote. Nothing. Clicked again. Still nothing. The silence in the room had grown thick and uncomfortable, like wool soaked in embarrassment. Technical difficulties, he'd laughed, trying to keep his voice light while sweat beaded along his hairline. Let me just... But Harold Meridian, the company's founder, and a man who looked like he could squeeze diamonds from coal with his bare hands, had already leaned back in his chair. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but Ethan had caught it. The universal body language of a man losing interest. Perhaps we should reschedule, Meridian had said, his voice carrying the kind of polite dismissal that meant never call us again. Give you time to work out the technical issues. Ethan had wanted to explain that this never happened, that his presentations were usually flawless, that he'd won 3 industry awards for his campaigns in the last 2 years. Instead, He'd nodded, packed up his useless laptop, and shaken hands with people who were already mentally moving on to their next meeting. The drive home had been a blur of self-recrimination and what-if scenarios. What if he'd had a backup plan? What if he'd tested the system beforehand? What if he'd just powered through without the slides, relied on his natural charm and encyclopedic knowledge of the material? What if, what if, what if? Now, sitting in his disabled car on a deserted highway with rain turning the world into a watercolor painting of grays and blacks, those questions felt laughably insignificant. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the landscape around him in stark, momentary detail. Empty fields stretched to the horizon on both sides of the highway, broken only by the occasional cluster of trees, bent nearly horizontal by the wind. In the distance, mountains loomed like sleeping giants, their peaks lost in low-hanging clouds. It was beautiful in a desolate, end-of-the-world kind of way. Ethan fumbled for his phone, squinting at the screen. No signal. Of course, there wasn't. He was probably 40 miles from the nearest cell tower, stranded in what might as well have been the middle of the Sahara, for all the good his smartphone was going to do him. He tried to remember if he'd passed any buildings recently, any signs of civilization where he might find help. There had been a truck stop, maybe 20 miles back, but there might as well have been 20,000, for all the good it did him now. Going forward, he couldn't recall seeing anything but more empty highway stretching toward Denver. The rain was getting worse. What had started as a steady downpour was evolving into something more aggressive, more personal. Water cascaded down his windshield in sheets, and the wind rocked the car with increasing violence. He could hear debris, branches probably, maybe trash, hitting the side of the BMW with dull, irregular thuds. Ethan closed his eyes and tried to think rationally. He had options. He could wait in the car until morning, hope that someone would come along and stop to help. He could attempt to change the tire himself, though he hadn't actually done that since driver's ed 15 years ago, and definitely not in conditions like these. Or he could start walking, try to find a house or a business, or at least a place with cell coverage. None of these options seemed particularly appealing. He popped the trunk and grabbed his umbrella, the expensive one that his ex-girlfriend Sarah had bought him for his birthday 2 years ago. Every successful executive needs a good umbrella, she'd said, and at the time, he'd thought it was pretentious. Now he was grateful for her pretension as he stepped out into the storm. The rain hit him like a physical force, soaking through his suit jacket in seconds, despite the umbrella. The wind threatened to turn the umbrella inside out, and he had to grip it with both hands to keep it from flying away into the darkness. His dress shoes, perfect for conference rooms and client dinners, offered zero traction on the wet asphalt. He slipped twice just walking to the back of the car. The trunk light revealed his spare tire, a jack, and a lug wrench that looked like it belonged in a museum. Everything was exactly where it should be, clean and unused. Ethan stared at the tools as if they might assemble themselves into a working, tire-changing mechanism through sheer force of will. How hard can it be, he thought, then immediately answered his own question. Very hard, especially in the middle of a monsoon. But what choice did he have? He couldn't stay in the car all night. The storm was getting worse, not better, and come morning he'd still be stranded on an empty highway with a flat tire and no way to call for help. Ethan rolled up his sleeves and got to work. 20 minutes later, he was soaked to the bone, covered in mud, and had managed to jack up the car and remove exactly 2 of the 5 lug nuts holding the destroyed tire in place. The remaining 3 seemed to be welded to the wheel by some combination of rust, age, and pure mechanical spite. His hands were raw from gripping the wrench, and every muscle in his back screamed in protest. The umbrella had given up the ghost 10 minutes ago, turned inside out by a particularly vicious gust of wind, and now lying in a ditch somewhere behind him. His suit, the same expensive navy blue number he'd worn to the disastrous presentation, was ruined beyond redemption. Sarah would have laughed at the irony. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, followed immediately by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the earth beneath his feet. The storm was moving directly over him, and standing next to a metal car with a metal jack seemed like an increasingly poor life choice. That's when he saw the lights. At first, he thought it was another lightning flash, but these lights were steady, moving, cutting through the rain like twin beacons of salvation. Headlights. Someone was coming. Ethan scrambled to his feet, waving his arms frantically as the vehicle approached. It was a pickup truck, an old one from the look of it, traveling slowly and carefully on the treacherous road. For a moment, he was sure it would pass him by. Just another stranded motorist, invisible in the storm. But the truck slowed, pulled over, and came to a stop about 20 feet behind his car. The driver's door opened, and a figure emerged into the rain. In the darkness and the storm, Ethan couldn't make out much detail, but the person seemed small and moved with the careful deliberation of someone much older than himself. They approached slowly, and as they got closer, Ethan could see it was an elderly woman, maybe 70, with grey hair plastered to her head and wearing what looked like a yellow rain slicker that had seen better decades. "You okay, honey?" she called out, her voice somehow carrying clearly over the storm. "Looks like you're having some trouble." Ethan wanted to laugh at the understatement. Trouble didn't begin to cover his current situation. Instead, he nodded gratefully and shouted back, "Tire blew out. I've been trying to change it, but these lug nuts won't budge." The woman nodded as if this was the most natural thing in the world to encounter at 1 in the morning on a deserted highway. "Well, let's have a look, shall we?" She walked past him to examine the tire, and Ethan was amazed to see her move with the confidence of someone who'd dealt with automotive emergencies before. She crouched down next to the wheel, seemingly oblivious to the rain soaking through her slicker, and gave the remaining lug nuts an experimental twist with the wrench. "Yep, they're stuck good," she said, standing up and brushing her hands on her slicker. "You need some leverage. Here, let me show you a trick." What followed was perhaps the most surreal 15 minutes of Ethan's life. The elderly woman, who introduced herself as Ruth, produced a small toolkit from her truck that would have made a NASCAR pit crew jealous. She showed him how to use the jack handle as additional leverage on the lug wrench, how to position himself for maximum force, and most importantly, how to use his whole body weight instead of just his arms. "Learned this from my late husband," she explained, as they worked together to free the stubborn nuts. "He was a mechanic for 40 years. Always said the secret wasn't strength, it was technique." Within minutes, they had the flat tire off and the spare mounted. Ruth worked with the easy competence of someone who'd done this dozens of times before, while Ethan mostly tried to stay out of her way and hand her tools when requested. It was humbling and oddly comforting at the same time. "There you go," Ruth said, lowering the jack and wiping her hands on a rag she'd produced from somewhere in her seemingly endless supply of useful items. "That spare'll get you home, but don't drive too fast on it. And get yourself a real tire first thing tomorrow." Ethan stood there in the rain, looking at this small, elderly woman who'd appeared out of nowhere to save his night, and felt something shift inside his chest. I don't know how to thank you. You didn't have to stop. Most people would have just driven past. Ruth smiled, and in the glow of the truck's headlights, her face looked kind and weathered, like someone who'd seen enough of life to understand that we all needed help sometimes. Honey, she said, I've been driving these roads for 50 years. I know what it's like to be stranded and scared. Besides, my grandson's about your age. I'd hope someone would stop for him if he needed help. She gathered up her tools and started walking back to her truck. Halfway there, she turned around. You know, she called out, whatever had you so upset when that tire blew, it's probably not as bad as you think. Bad days have a way of making everything seem worse than it really is. Morning has a way of putting things in perspective. And with that, she climbed back into her truck and drove off into the storm, leaving Ethan standing on the side of the highway with a working car and a head full of thoughts he wasn't quite ready to examine. The drive home was uneventful. The spare tire held, the rain began to let up, and by the time he reached the outskirts of Denver, the storm had passed entirely. The city lights looked warm and welcoming. After the darkness of the highway, and for the first time in hours, Ethan felt like he could breathe normally again. As he pulled into his apartment complex's parking garage, he caught sight of himself in the rearview mirror. His hair was still damp, his expensive suit was destroyed, and there was a streak of mud across his left cheek. He looked like he'd been through a war, but he also looked different somehow. Less polished, maybe, but more real, more human. His phone, which had regained signal somewhere outside the city, buzzed with missed messages and voicemails. Most were from his assistant, wondering where he was and whether he needed anything. One was from his mother, asking how the presentation had gone. And one, surprisingly, was from Harold Meridian himself. Ethan listened to the voicemail as he rode the elevator up to his apartment. Miller, this is Harold Meridian. I wanted to apologize for how things ended today. My tech people tell me there was a system-wide malfunction that affected several conference rooms. It wasn't anything you did wrong. If you're still interested, I'd like to reschedule for next week. You came highly recommended, and I'd hate to let a technical glitch cost us both a good opportunity. Give me a call. Ethan stood in his apartment, still dripping rain onto his hardwood floors, and started to laugh. It began as a chuckle, then built into full-blown laughter that echoed off his walls and probably annoyed his neighbors. The presentation failure that had seemed like the end of the world 12 hours ago was nothing more than a computer malfunction. The career-ending disaster was just a hiccup. Ruth had been right. Morning, or in this case, the end of a very long night, did have a way of putting things in perspective. He thought about calling Harold back immediately, but decided it could wait until actual morning. Right now, he needed a shower, dry clothes, and about 10 hours of sleep. Tomorrow, he could deal with being a successful marketing executive again. Tonight, he was just grateful to be home, safe, and reminded that sometimes the worst days led to the most important lessons, and the guardian angels sometimes came in the form of elderly women with yellow rain slickers and 40 years' worth of automotive wisdom. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Ethan found himself thinking not about the presentation or the tire, or even Harold Meridian's unexpected voicemail. Instead, he thought about Ruth, driving through the storm on roads she'd traveled for 5 decades, always ready to stop for a stranger in need. He hoped that When he was her age, he'd have that same kind of courage, that same instinct to help others when they needed it most. It seemed like a better way to measure success than quarterly reports and client presentations. The rain had stopped completely now, and through his bedroom window, he could see the first pale hints of dawn breaking over the mountains. It was going to be a beautiful day. Perfect, he muttered, letting his head fall back against the leather headrest. Absolutely fucking perfect. The presentation had been a disaster from the moment he'd walked into that sterile conference room in Colorado Springs. 3 months of preparation, 3 months of late nights and weekend work, all culminating in 45 minutes of watching his carefully crafted campaign get torn apart by clients who seemed more interested in flexing their corporate muscles than actually listening to innovative ideas. The Peterson account, the biggest potential client his firm had seen in years, had walked out halfway through his presentation, citing creative differences that felt more like personal insults. Now, sitting in his disabled car on Highway 24 with rain drumming against the roof like impatient fingers, Ethan felt the weight of his entire carefully constructed life pressing down on him. His phone showed no signal. Of course it didn't. Not out here in the middle of nowhere between Colorado Springs and Denver, where civilization seemed to disappear into endless stretches of pine trees and mountain shadows. He'd taken this route because it was scenic, because he thought the mountain views might clear his head after the disaster of the meeting. Now the scenic beauty felt more like isolation, the kind that reminded him just how alone he really was. When was the last time someone had called him just to check in? When was the last time he'd felt genuinely connected to another human being, rather than just professionally networked? The rain was getting worse, if that was possible. What had started as a steady downpour had escalated into a full-blown mountain storm, the kind that turned highways into rivers and made driving treacherous even for locals who knew these roads by heart. Lightning flickered across the sky, illuminating the jagged peaks that surrounded the valley, making the landscape look both beautiful and vaguely threatening. Ethan pulled his phone out again, hoping for even a single bar of service. Nothing. He tried anyway, watching the call fail with a mechanical chirp that somehow sounded smug in the darkness. His roadside assistance app required internet connectivity, which was about as useful as his expensive suit in this situation. Which was to say, not at all. He could wait until morning, he supposed, sleep in the car, and hope that daylight would bring other travelers, someone with a working phone, or the mechanical knowledge to change a tire. But the thought of spending the night in his car, listening to the rain and replaying his failures, made his chest tight with claustrophobia. The storm seemed to be getting angrier by the minute. Wind rocked the car gently, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the ominous rumble of thunder moving closer. This wasn't just rain anymore. It was a full mountain tempest, the kind of weather that could turn deadly fast if you weren't prepared for it. Ethan had never been less prepared for anything in his life. He checked his watch. 12:47 a.m. The meeting had ended at 9, and he'd spent nearly 2 hours afterwards sitting in his rental car in the hotel parking lot, trying to work up the courage to call his boss and explain why they'd just lost their biggest potential account. He'd finally given up on that conversation. It could wait until morning, when he might have figured out how to spin this disaster into something less career-ending. Now, staring out at the empty highway through rain-streaked windows, Ethan wondered if his career was the least of his problems. He'd always been a planner, someone who scheduled his life in 15-minute increments and had backup plans for his backup plans. His apartment was organized to the point of obsession, his calendar color-coded, his emergency kit meticulously stocked with everything except, apparently, the ability to change a tire in a thunderstorm. He'd been so focused on controlling every aspect of his professional life that he'd somehow forgotten to account for the random chaos of actual living. The irony wasn't lost on him that his perfectly planned life had been derailed by something as mundane as a flat tire. Another flash of lightning lit up the landscape, and for a moment, Ethan could see the full scope of his surroundings. Mountains rose on both sides of the highway like sleeping giants, their peaks lost in low-hanging clouds. Pine trees stretched endlessly in both directions, broken only by the ribbon of asphalt that had become his prison. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that made his chest ache with something he couldn't name. When was the last time he'd really looked at anything beautiful? When was the last time he'd noticed a sunset that wasn't framed by his office window? Or heard a bird song that wasn't interrupted by traffic? His life had become so focused on the next deadline, the next presentation, the next rung on the corporate ladder, that he'd forgotten there was a whole world existing parallel to his carefully constructed routine. The thought should have been liberating. Instead, it felt terrifying. His hands were shaking, and not just from the cold. The adrenaline from the blowout was wearing off, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that had been building for months. He'd been running on caffeine and ambition for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to actually rest, to exist without the constant pressure of performance metrics and client expectations. Maybe this was rock bottom, he thought. Sitting alone in a broken-down car in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but his failures for company and a storm that seemed determined to wash away what was left of his dignity. Maybe this was what he deserved for building a life so focused on success that he'd forgotten to actually live it. But just as despair began to settle over him like a familiar blanket, Ethan saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. Headlights, growing brighter through the sheets of rain, approaching from the direction of Colorado Springs. At first, he didn't dare hope. It could be anyone, someone who would drive past without a second glance, leaving him to face the storm alone. But as the vehicle drew closer, its pace slowing, Ethan felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Hope. The truck, and it was definitely a truck, big and sturdy, looking, pulled over behind his BMW, hazard lights flashing like a beacon in the darkness. Through his rain-streaked rear window, Ethan could see a figure climbing out of the driver's seat, apparently unbothered by the downpour that had kept Ethan trapped in his car. This was it. This was the moment his terrible day either got worse or became something else entirely. As boots crunched across gravel toward his car, Ethan realized that sometimes salvation comes in the most unexpected forms, at the most impossible times, wearing work clothes instead of shining armor. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, getting stranded on a dark highway isn't the end of your story. Stranded with no cell service and dressed in his expensive suit, Ethan represents everything opposite to the rugged mountain landscape surrounding him. He's the classic city boy, all sharp edges and carefully controlled life, someone who schedules his coffee breaks and hasn't touched dirt in years. But tonight, the universe has other plans. Enter Caleb Rodriguez, 32 years old, third-generation rancher, with calloused hands and a heart bigger than the Montana sky. He's driving his beaten-up Ford pickup after checking on cattle during the storm when his headlights catch a figure hunched over a disabled BMW. Most people might keep driving on such a dangerous night, But Caleb isn't most people. Warmly, he's the kind of man who stops for injured animals, helps elderly neighbors with groceries, and apparently rescues stranded city boys without expecting anything in return. This setup perfectly embodies the classic BL trope of opposites attracting. The polished urbanite meets the rugged countryman. But unlike typical yaoi manhwa where attraction is instant, this story builds something deeper. Caleb sees past Ethan's designer clothes to the vulnerability underneath. Ethan, despite his initial wariness, recognizes genuine kindness when he sees it. The mountain setting becomes almost a character itself. Vast, unforgiving, but breathtakingly beautiful. It's the perfect backdrop for two men from different worlds to discover they might need exactly what the other can offer. The storm that stranded Ethan isn't just weather. It's the catalyst that will challenge everything both men thought they knew about themselves and what they want from life. When Caleb pulls over and rolls down his window, Ethan's first instinct is suspicion, tense. A stranger stopping on an empty highway at midnight. Every city survival instinct screams danger. But there's something about Caleb's genuine concern. You okay there? That tire's completely shredded, that cuts through Ethan's defenses. I'm fine, Ethan lies, soaked and shivering, just waiting for roadside assistance. But his phone shows no signal, and they both know help isn't coming anytime soon. Caleb doesn't push, just quietly gets out and assesses the damage. "You've got a spare?" he asks, already knowing the answer when he sees Ethan's expression. The first conflict isn't romantic, it's practical survival clashing with stubborn pride. Ethan doesn't want to accept help, especially from someone who looks like he stepped out of a Western movie. Meanwhile, Caleb can't just leave another human being stranded, regardless of their attitude. Softly, "Look, I've got a spare tire at my ranch. It's 20 minutes away. You can stay warm in my truck, or you can freeze out here, being independent. Your choice." The drive to Caleb's ranch becomes an exploration of their differences. Ethan, still defensive, makes subtle comments about small-town life and simple living. Caleb, patient but not doormat-like, responds with dry humor. "Yeah, we're real simple out here. Just running businesses, managing livestock, and apparently rescuing ungrateful city boys who think expensive suits make them better than everyone else." Dramatic pause. That's the moment Ethan realizes he's been an absolute arse. The real conflict emerges when they reach Caleb's ranch, and Ethan sees a life completely foreign to his own. The cozy cabin, the photos of family gatherings, the well-worn furniture that speaks of comfort over style. It represents everything Ethan thought he was too sophisticated to want. But there's a warmth here, an authenticity that his sterile apartment lacks. "You can stay the night," Caleb offers after fixing the tire. Roads are dangerous in this weather. But Ethan's already planning his escape, making polite excuses about early meetings and important obligations. He's running from something he can't name. The way Caleb's laugh makes his chest tight. How natural it feels to accept a cup of coffee from work-roughened hands. The conflict deepens over the following weeks, when Ethan finds excuses to drive this route more often. Business meetings that don't exist, scenic drives that always seem to pass Caleb's ranch, whisper tone. He tells himself it's curiosity, but his heart knows better. On-screen, denial, pining, gay romance development. Caleb, meanwhile, struggles with his own demons. His last relationship ended when his ex called ranch life boring and limiting. Now here's another city man who seems interested, but clearly sees Caleb's lifestyle as quaint at best. He'll get bored, Caleb tells his border collie, Scout. They always do. The emotional tension builds through stolen moments, shared meals, when Ethan's car trouble coincidentally happens near dinner time. Conversations that run deeper than small talk. The electric moment when Caleb teaches Ethan to horseback ride, and their bodies are closer than friendship requires. But the central conflict isn't just internal, it's practical. Ethan's boss threatens his job if his performance doesn't improve. Caleb faces financial pressure when beef prices drop. Their different worlds aren't just emotional barriers. They're real-life obstacles that money and good intentions can't easily solve. The breaking point comes when Ethan's company offers him a promotion in Seattle. 2,000 miles from Colorado, from mountain sunrises and a cowboy whose quiet strength has become essential as breathing. Softly, for the first time in his career-focused life, Ethan has to choose between professional success and personal happiness. The confession happens during a thunderstorm, because of course it does. Dramatic pause. Ethan arrives at Caleb's ranch soaked and desperate, having driven straight from the airport where he was supposed to board a flight to Seattle for his new job interview. I can't do it, Ethan says, standing in Caleb's doorway like a man possessed. I can't pretend anymore that what I want is in some corporate office on the other side of the country. Caleb, who's been preparing himself for goodbye, stares at this beautiful, disheveled man who's just thrown away everything he claimed to value. Ethan, what are you talking about? I'm talking about this. Ethan gestures between them, his voice cracking with emotion. About coffee that tastes like home and hands that know how to fix things. About feeling more myself in your kitchen than I ever have in a boardroom. Whisper tone. I'm talking about being in love with you and terrified that you think I'm just another city boy playing cowboy until something better comes along. The kiss that follows is desperate, hungry, 3 months of denied want pouring out in the space between lightning and thunder. Caleb's hands tangle in Ethan's hair, pulling him closer, and when they break apart, both men are breathing hard. You sure about this? Caleb whispers against Ethan's forehead. Because I can't be your experiment. I can't be something you try on and discard when reality hits. Softly. Then don't be, Ethan replies. Be my reality instead. 6 months later, Ethan's learned that happiness doesn't always look like you thought it would. He's freelancing now, trading corporate security for the freedom to work remotely from a ranch that's become home. His hands have calluses from fence repairs, and his wardrobe includes actual work boots. But more than the external changes, Ethan's discovered parts of himself he never knew existed. The man who finds peace in morning chores, who can laugh at his own mistakes, who's brave enough to love someone completely different from himself. Caleb, too, has grown. He's learned that love doesn't require someone to change everything about themselves, just to be willing to build something new together. Warmly. Their differences haven't disappeared. They've become strengths, each man offering what the other lacks. Sometimes the best love stories begin with the worst days, and sometimes getting lost is exactly how you find your way home. What did you think of Ethan and Caleb's love story? Drop a comment with your reaction. Were you rooting for them from the beginning, or did the slow burn have you on the edge of your seat? Subscribe for more heartwarming BL romance stories and gay love story breakdowns. Check the description for similar cowboy romance recommendations.